The Exeter Impact podcast is returning for a second series. In Series 2, we talk primarily to colleagues working at our Penryn campus in Cornwall, making a significant impact. The podcast is developed and hosted by me, Emma Sheriff, Impact Evidence and Evaluation Manager for Policy and Systems at the university. In this episode, we welcome Professor Harry Pitts. Thank you for joining us today, Harry.
Thank you, Emma.
Your research focuses both on political economy and the future of work. Can you tell us a bit more about your work and your research interests, please?
So I'm an interdisciplinary scholar of what I would call the political economy of the future of work. If I had to choose a disciplinary title, it would probably be a political economist, by which I mean I'm not an economist, but I'm someone interested in the political decisions made about the economy, and I'm particularly interested in how they bear upon work and employment.
So why do you think you were particularly drawn to academic research in this field?
Growing up, the only person I knew who was an academic or probably had even been to university was probably Indiana Jones. I mean, I didn't know Indiana Jones, but Indiana Jones was the only role model I would have to represent anything resembling an academic. You know, I came from a working class family. No one had been to university. I also grew up in Cornwall where, because of the peripheralised character of where I grew up, the university campus opened when I was just finishing school. And I just basically did whichever course I could do on campus. So then part-time alongside working, I did a master's in critical global politics at University of Exeter, when Exeter moved down onto the Cornwall campus. And that kind of, the one thing that remains central to all of those different changes, as it has done in my academic career, is that I was interested in work. It was always the thing that was being discussed all the time and still is in my family. At that time, as an impressionable, budding academic, was really interested in the work of Marx and Marxism as a way of understanding work in capitalist society. And that kind of anchored my interest that took me forward and eventually saw me go on to do a PhD and take that study further. I ended up doing my PhD about work and about Marxist approaches to that, and branched out into doing empirical research around that as well.
It's really interesting that you come from that place and that your study has been inspired almost by your situation, and that was the springboard to your PhD. I think that's interesting.
And it was also about trying to understand the changing world of work as well. The types of jobs that I had when I was growing up, were not in skilled trades. They weren't in industrial or agricultural occupations. They were in call centres or temp work in offices or, sales jobs and things like that, which allowed me to see a kind of changing, more service-based economy and the role of young workers within that being one myself. So I was on 0 hours contracts before it became a fashionable term, and I was always working alongside bits and pieces of study in those kind of precarious occupations. So I was really interested in understanding how that world of work had emerged out of the world of work that I grew up seeing as my reference point, which was a totally different type of world of work based upon kind of larger industrial employers and skilled trades.
That's really interesting. And what do you think are the key findings that you've uncovered, and how have you gone about doing that?
Part of my work is empirical, going out and doing interviews and workplace research and things like that. The other part of my work is more theoretical, or in terms of building arguments and building perspectives that then shift debate and trying to achieve impact through that as well, giving people frames for how they understand and argue about the world. And I think in terms of working with politics and policy, there is a space for that latter bit of work there as well. Yes. It's not just about the evidence, it's also about the argument as well. But the findings are certain kind of persistent elements of the way the labour process is organised that mean work isn't always a brave new world, that there's a lot of things that are still in common. And that means that how we contest and regulate that world of work, we can also draw upon familiar toolboxes of approaches. And not everything is always some type of impending utopia or dystopia. You can kind of hold the fort a little bit. And then, in terms of thinking about the political implications of that and making those arguments, a lot of bold a lot of bold moves are made on the basis of mistaken understandings about the way the world of work is going. A lot of claims are made about what constitutes a suitable electoral coalition, or who should be benefited by policy, or who are the workers of the future and where is that going. And, I was a beneficiary in a way of a gambit that was made in the 1990s, that the UK was going to have a knowledge economy, a service-driven knowledge economy where working class kids could be extended the opportunity to go into university, which I was a beneficiary of. And of course, I do have a job in a knowledge economy. I have a job in the industry known as higher education. Yeah. But for many people, the promise of that wasn't realised. Actually, the real economy that was ticking along in the background, the real story of where global power lied, was on control over physical resources and assets and supply chains, sure. and ultimately manufacturing capability, which now we're learning to our cost was a mistaken gambit. So claims made about the way industry is changing or the way work is changing have a lot of political ramifications. And I guess I've taken it upon myself to try to be a bit of grit in the oyster, really, in some of the bolder claims made about the way the world of work is changing now and the mistaken political paths that are taken through that. But of course, impact usually comes through having a discernible change in behaviour on what people do. But I think the role of, I have a background really as what might be called a critical theorist. The role of critical theory is to also say that path is best not taken. But of course, you can't always prove that you're the one who prevented that being taken. So no. I think it's you can contribute your voice to a groundswell of other criticism and debate. But it's not always as simple as bringing a piece of evidence to the table and that equaling impact.
How do you see AI moving into the workplace and the future of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's undoubtedly having a big transformation on the workplace. And some of the areas of work that are being most impacted by it are in areas like professional services, where, the pay is reasonably good, terms and conditions are quite good, and it's challenging those kind of underpinning ways of organising work. And with that, the livelihoods potentially of those doing it. At the same time, the way that previous technological transformations are operated has been very long and protracted. It's been very slow. It's not like one day the humans march out of the factory and the robots march in. It's gradual augmentation of work that changes that work. And it tends to, I think for a long time there was a big debate over jobs going. I think if we look at individual tasks maybe going or being replaced or substituted for, you get the idea of jobs that are changing by being augmented by things like AI, rather than it being this vast kind of dumping of a huge amount of the workforce on the scrap heap of history, which is an excessive claim. The question is whether it can realise productivity increases and things like that the workers can benefit from. And I think that's why the politics of work is really important. In the past, where you had strong industrial relations, it meant the workers were often beneficiaries of productivity improvements because they had the ability to have job security, but also bargain around productivity improvements, so that if effort was going up, they were able to command higher wages or reductions in working hours. Now, one thing our economy lacks, apart from in some remaining collectively bargained workplaces, usually in heavy industry and public sector settings, is that kind of prevalence of power in the economy, whereby if there is productivity improvements, they can be negotiated over. People can feel they participate in those. Yeah. And my concern is that whilst AI might not result in workers being expelled from industry or the jobs they're in, that the improvements that are possible through that to techniques and to processes won't be to the benefit of employees, because there isn't the power that's distributed across the economy for them to really feel participants in that process.
So I'm going to move on now to talk about pathways to impact and your reflections. How did you go about achieving impact in practice in policy and politics?
I was putting myself out there by making sure that I was writing about things in a way that was accessible to other audiences beyond academia. And, I found people who were able to take me under their wing or, act as kind of stakeholders, I guess, in some of the arguments that I was making and take them into a sphere that previously I wouldn't have had access to in politics and policy, because they were seen as being useful for a debate about the future of the Labour Party, for instance, and within that debate about the future of the UK. A lot of the work I did subsequently has largely been framed around, using the interest of others as the starting point of what it is I do. Each time I've been taking cues from people, co-authoring also with politicians and policymakers. So not just co-authoring within academia, but that exchange of ideas that comes through writing together, which I think is a really useful thing for making us flexible about the way we write. Working as much really on policy reports for external organisations as I have on academic journal articles during that time. Making sure I'm keeping the time available to write that stuff that speaks to a broader audience, or always digesting one in the form of the other. And then I guess another theme that alongside that has been, I was hired into a business school at a time where business schools were hiring a lot of people that didn't seem to really necessarily to belong in business schools, right? Marxist sociologists and political theorists like myself have been hired in business schools because we were interested in material dynamics in the workplace. We're interested in how workplaces are organised. We're interested in, in the labour process. And I wouldn't describe myself any longer as a Marxist, but back then I was. But I went and worked in the business school, and that opened up so much opportunity to actually go out there and work with businesses, large businesses, small businesses,
the relationships,
cooperatives, and to see in action the way that those industries and those workplaces worked. And that meant, I started to think a lot more about how the big changes play out in concrete scenarios and concrete situations. At the moment, I'm working with BT on a few projects about the future of work as part of the Centre for Socio-Digital Futures. I'm doing some work with Babcock about SMEs and defence supply chains, and that kind of defence dividend idea about how the benefits of defence investment are felt in different places. I work with many businesses in Cornwall, which has become a major focus of my work as I've returned home to Cornwall, thinking about working with local organisations and local council on what I would call local industrial strategy or and economic development. That they're new themes in my work, but they've all come from this thread of trying to respond to the cues that I'm getting from the people I'm talking to who are outside academia, and it's steering my work towards what's going to be most meaningful for them.
What do you think have been the specific challenges that you've faced working with the stakeholders you've mentioned, and maybe some others that you've not mentioned?
The thing about politics and policies, it can be a very fickle kind of space to engage with because there's a churn in the people involved.
Sure.
Sometimes the people that you're working with, sometimes their own trajectories take your ideas into places that you might not necessarily have expected them to go.
Of course.
Sometimes the contacts that you've made move or change or are displaced, and that can make it quite difficult to navigate that sometimes. And then I think in terms of working with other stakeholders, I think in terms of engaging with business and other external organisations, you have to make a stronger argument over why, things about frames and discourses and ideas are as relevant as numbers or as evidence. And sometimes our role as academics is to play that kind of Socratic role of asking difficult questions, of bringing to bear things that are beyond the run-of-the-mill everyday life of organisations. People working in businesses don't have time to think about everything about the geopolitical reshaping of capitalism or the crumbling liberal world order and its implications for their businesses. But we might have the ability to create a space where they can engage with those ideas. And then some of the other work I've done in a local context in Cornwall since moving back around things like workforce and skills strategy and socio-economic foundations for good growth. Part of that is also navigating what is sometimes quite a close-knit set of organisations where my intellectual tradition, I guess, is about arguments. It's about presenting a vision of where the world is going. And I think when you're dealing with a local situation where you're working with lots of stakeholders from across different sectors and organisations, navigating anxieties about who is included in the vision that you're setting out is, as academics, we can be quite bold sometimes in the things we come forward with, but everyone likes to feel that they can have a slice of the action. you actually have to put time into building those relationships. And that's been, for me, it was always my ambition, having gone away to build an academic career, was to go back home to Cornwall, but to go back there and then be able to use that position of authenticity that I had as a Cornish person and someone who was already had good connections with the community, to then combine that with aspects of the work I've been doing nationally around political economy, industrial policy, work and employment. It's been really, really fulfilling. And it's allowed me to keep those kind of warm relationships that allow you entry into the conversation, but then also allow you to build consensus around the types of arguments being put forward.
What do you feel are your reflections overall on the impactful research that you've led?
I mean, there are the small wins which you really celebrate one at a time. So, the idea that your work gets covered in The Economist or the Financial Times or the Times or the Guardian, or quoted in a speech by a politician, or they're great, and you can really say, look, there I am. There's other more subtle things which are harder to share because there's the implication that something's in it, or that you've had some input into a line in a speech, but it's not necessarily your name isn't in there, but that somewhere in that kind of mix has been something you've done. Or or a shift in the way people talk about things, or hear someone interviewed on the radio and they've read your work and that they say something that you're in the mix with, and that's really rewarding. But you keep it to yourself, and that gives you a really good feeling about your work, to know that those changes are there, and sometimes they're very subtle. But again, it comes back to the point I said earlier. It's about, if you're changing the way people talk about things and think about things, they're less likely to make the missteps that I've analysed in my academic work. They're less likely to take those paths that are better not taken. The ability to have worked with Cornwall Council on initiatives like the Workforce and Skills Strategy in collaboration with my colleagues in the Institute of Cornish Studies, for instance, and then to see some things I've been writing about for a really long time actually being, the rubber hitting the road, really, in terms of actually having to write something that's really policy focused on thinking about the place I care the most about and what can benefit that, has been really rewarding. And I think, Cornwall's sense of where it's going and the contribution it can make to the future political economy of these islands as a whole, in terms of the contribution it makes to security, to sustainability, to supply chains, to sovereign capability in a range of different, both existing and growing industries and forms of infrastructure. I think, I want to be able to say that I've played a part in that narrative about where it's going. I've always been more keen on the impact with a small I, which could also be called influence in a way. Yes. How do your ideas have influence on the world? And that's a very conventional thing, which I would call, in a way, it sounds like a grand title, but it's that kind of public intellectual role, which a lot of academics don't always have the confidence all the time to be able to engage with, but actually is a very traditional idea about what we do as academics, is to be publicly engaged.
Yes.
But not in a way that everything is always driven by thinking, here's the impact I'm going to achieve, but it's just about being out there in society, out there in the media, out there in the worlds of policy and politics, playing a role when asked or when you think you've got something to say to a situation. And it's important, I think, for academics to see that as a part of the portfolio activities that we do, because I think it's also part of our commitment to the publics and the societies that we serve in our role within higher education. I think a general kind of practical thing about doing what, or seeking impact, let's say, would be, that you can only really achieve it if the world's ready to listen. So you have to adjust yourself instrumentally to the shift in priorities and where the conversation is at, and find a way into that conversation.
Finally, what one single piece of advice would you share with our listeners and viewers to help them ensure their research impact is achieved?
The key thing for having a pathway to impact on the beginning of a project, I think, is to be responsive to what people outside academia find meaningful and useful. If you're interested in impact, I think it has to be that the ideas about what it is you're doing are themselves co-produced by, having a constant and warm relationship and conversation. So I think just keeping that kind of relationship and seeing ourselves as academics already embedded in those worlds that we seek to have impact in, as opposed to having an external relationship with that world whereby we do the research, then take it there. It's much more about the research coming out of that engagement in the first place. And I think that's a really important lesson to take away.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in the episode today. Thank you so much for your participation in the Exeter Impact podcast.
Thank you.
Exeter staff can access the university's Impactful Researcher training series and find details of our impact surgeries via the episode links for support to plan impact in readiness for writing an impact case study.